The woman who stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas on a scorched Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1878 was carrying three things: a battered leather trunk, a name that did not belong to her, and a grief so dense it had settled into her bones like iron. Her name, the name she had given to the stagecoach driver back in Wichita when he asked her destination and passenger details, was Clara Redmond. She had written it on the registry herself, pressing the pen hard enough into the paper that the ink bled through to the page beneath. Clara Redmond, her sister's name, her dead sister's name. The woman's real name was Esther. Caldwell in the summer of 1878 was not a gentle place. It sat at the southern edge of Kansas like a dare, just north of the Cherokee Strip, and it received drovers and cowboys, and cattle merchants and gamblers and men of uncertain occupation, with the same flat, unblinking tolerance it offered to the prairie wind. The main street was unpaved and wide, rutted deep by wagon wheels and hoofbeats, and the smell of cattle was never entirely absent no matter how far from the stockyards you stood. The town had a post office, 2 general stores, a livery stable, a land office, 3 saloons, a hotel called the Drover's Rest, and a woman named Hattie Oakes who ran a boarding house on the west end of Maple Street and was known to be fair but firm about the rules. Esther had been corresponding with Hattie Oakes for the better part of 3 months, only she had been doing so under her sister's name. It had seemed like a reasonable plan when she had formed it, sitting in the wreckage of the life she had known in Ohio, staring at the stack of letters Clara had received from a woman in Kansas who needed a reliable boarder and a part-time seamstress. Clara had been planning to come west. Clara had wanted the wide sky and the new beginning, had talked about it endlessly through the last cold months of 1877, while the typhoid fever was still only a rumor 2 counties over. And then the typhoid had not stayed a rumor, and Clara had died in April with her hair spread across a damp pillow and her future letters all still unwritten. Esther had written them instead. Not out of deception, not at first, or at least not in the way that felt entirely dishonest. She had written them out of desperation, because she had no money of her own that would sustain her through a winter alone, because the house they had shared had been rented in Clara's name, and the landlord had no patience for a grieving younger sister with no income, because she had watched her sister's face light up every time a letter came from Kansas, and she had thought, with the particular logic of the desperate, that perhaps she could carry that dream west even if she could not carry Clara. She was 25 years old and she had been alone in the world since April, and the name on the boarding house correspondence was a small lie when held against the enormity of what she had lost. She stood now in the street outside the stagecoach station with her trunk at her feet and the sun pressing down on her shoulders through the thin fabric of her gray traveling dress, and she looked at the town around her and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she had no idea what she was doing here. "You look like somebody who's not sure this was the right stop." The voice came from her left. She turned and found a man leaning against the post of the station awning, not lounging in the lazy way that spoke of idleness, but standing with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to be economical with his energy. He was tall, with dark hair that curled a little at the collar, and his face was weathered in the way that outdoor work weathered a person, the kind of tan that came from years rather than seasons. He wore dusty trousers and a plain cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and there was a battered hat pushed back on his head at an angle that suggested he had forgotten it was there. He was, Esther estimated, somewhere in his late 20s. His eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, a kind of gray-green that shifted as he moved out of the shade. "I am certain it was the right stop," she said, which was only half true. "I am less certain about what comes next." "That's fair," he said. He pushed off the post and came to stand a few feet away, not crowding her, keeping a respectful distance. "Edwin Walden," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I work the Lachlan spread about 6 miles east. I'm in town picking up feed. Can I help you with that trunk?" Clara Redmond, she said, and hated herself a little for how easily it came out now. I'm looking for the Oaks boarding house on Maple Street. I know it, Edwin said. That's on my way out of town. He bent and lifted the trunk before she could protest, which she had been intending to do, settling it under one arm with an ease that suggested he was accustomed to lifting things considerably heavier. It's not far, maybe 2 blocks and a turn. She fell into step beside him, and the street received them both without comment because Caldwell was that kind of town, busy with its own business, indifferent to new arrivals. You coming to stay with Hattie? Edwin asked. Boarding and work, Esther said. She mentioned needing someone who could sew. I have that skill. Hattie's good people, Edwin said. He said it with the warmth of genuine regard, not the obligatory politeness of someone who could not think of anything else to say. She's been here since before most of the town was built. Her husband was a freighter. He died some years back, and she turned the house into the boarding house to keep it. He paused. She's direct. Some people find that difficult. I don't, Esther said, and she meant it, because directness was something she had always valued, which made the lie she was living sit all the more uncomfortably in her chest. They reached the boarding house, which was a 2-story frame building painted white, with a porch that ran the full length of the front and flower boxes in the windows that held something Esther recognized as black-eyed Susans. The flowers were so ordinary, so familiar, so much like the ones Clara had grown in pots in their Ohio kitchen, that Esther had to stop walking for a moment and press her lips together and breathe. Edwin did not comment on this. He simply waited, which was a particular kindness, because most people filled silences, and the silences were sometimes the only thing she had left. Hattie Oaks was a woman of perhaps 50, stout and competent-looking, with gray-streaked hair pinned back severely and eyes that did exactly what Edwin had warned. They looked at you and assessed you without any pretense of not doing so. Clara Redmond, she said, looking Esther over on the porch. Yes, Esther said. You're younger than I pictured. I'm 25. Hattie looked at Edwin. Edwin, tell your boss I need a word with him about the fence on the north pasture edge. Yes, ma'am, Edwin said, setting down the trunk. He looked at Esther. He had a way of looking at her that she could not quite categorize. It was not rude, and it was not dismissive. It was more like the careful attention a person paid to something they wanted to understand. Welcome to Caldwell, Miss Redmond. Thank you, Mr. Walden, she said. He touched his hat again and walked back down the street, and Esther watched him go for exactly as long as was reasonable before she picked up one end of her trunk and followed Hattie inside. The room Hattie showed her to was small and clean and smelled of lavender and lye soap, with a window that looked out over the backyard, and a narrow bed with a quilt in blue and white. There was a washstand and a mirror and a hook on the door, and a small desk under the window where the light was good for sewing. Esther put her hand on the windowsill and looked out at the yard and the flat horizon beyond it, and the sky above the horizon that was, she had to admit, exactly as wide as Clara had promised it would be. You all right? Hattie asked from the doorway. Yes, Esther said. Just tired from the journey. Hattie looked at her for a moment with those direct eyes. You eat dinner downstairs at 6, she said. I don't run a restaurant. What's on the table is what there is. I have 3 other boarders. Mr. Pell runs the land office. Mr. Carmichael is a cattle agent, and Miss Fry gives piano lessons at the schoolhouse. She paused. I'll need you in the shop 2 mornings a week, Tuesday and Thursday, and on Saturdays when there's dress work to be done. The rest of your time is your own. That suits me, Esther said. Good. Hattie turned to go, then stopped. You're in mourning, she said. It was not a question. Esther opened her mouth to deny it, to say she was fine, that the gray dress was just a preference, that she had left her grief in Ohio. Yes, she said instead. Hattie nodded once, with a dignity that contained no pity and no prurience. This is a good place to keep living, she said, and left. Esther sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of Caldwell settling around her, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of wagon wheels, the piano starting up somewhere 2 streets over, a bar of something hymn-like, repeated and then amended. She put her hand flat on the blue and white quilt and thought of Clara, and let herself cry just once briefly before she unpacked her trunk. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were purposeful, which was, Esther was finding, the closest thing to comfort that the territory offered. She worked in Hattie's small sewing shop on the ground floor of the boarding house, alterations and new dresses, and the occasional bit of embroidery work, and the work was something she could do well, which mattered when so many other things felt uncertain. The other boarders were as Hattie had described them. Mr. Pell was a quiet man with ink-stained fingers who read at dinner. Mr. Carmichael was loud and cheerful and interested in cattle to the exclusion of nearly every other topic. Miss Fry was young and pretty and homesick for Missouri, and she and Esther formed the kind of easy, surface-level friendship that evening meals and a shared parlor encouraged. Caldwell revealed itself to Esther gradually, the way any real place did, not all at once in a postcard impression, but in accumulation, one Tuesday morning and one Saturday afternoon at a time. She learned which side of the main street got the morning shade. She learned that the best bread came from a German woman named Mrs. Hecht, who sold it from her house on a Thursday. She learned that the cattle drives came through from the south at irregular intervals and turned the town loud and busy and slightly dangerous for a stretch of days, and that the wise policy was to do your shopping before the drovers arrived. She learned the names of the men who worked the nearby ranches and farms, because they came into town with regularity, and the boarding house dining table was a natural clearinghouse for local information. She learned that Edwin Walden was 28 years old, that he had come to Kansas from Missouri 6 years ago, that he was the foreman now of the Lachlan spread, which was a cattle operation of several hundred acres to the east, that he was well regarded by everyone who knew him, and that he came into town every Tuesday without fail to collect mail and supplies. She learned these things gradually, through the ordinary currency of small-town conversation, and she told herself she was merely learning the landscape of the place she now lived, which was the sensible thing to do. What she could not quite account for, using purely practical reasoning, was the fact that she found herself noticing when his horse was tied outside the general store, or that she had twice resorted the spools of thread on the sewing shop counter while he was visible through the window, which had accomplished nothing except to give her something to do with her hands. The second Tuesday of her second week in Caldwell, Edwin came into the sewing shop. This was not unusual in itself. Men came in sometimes for buttons or to have a tear mended. Hattie was out back, so it was Esther who looked up from the dress she was hemming when the bell above the door rang. "Mr. Walden," she said. "Miss Redmond," he said, removing his hat. "I heard Hattie has some interfacing she ordered for me, for the bunkhouse curtains. The boys complain about the morning light." "Cowboys complaining about morning light," Esther said. "They work hard," Edwin said without defensiveness. "They're entitled to sleep past sunrise occasionally." She liked that. She found herself liking a great many small things about him. The way he did not over-explain himself but was never curt. The way his eyes went serious when he was listening. The way he seemed entirely comfortable with his own presence in a room without needing to dominate it. She found the interfacing in the back and brought it out, and he paid for it, and she wrote it in the ledger, and he did not leave immediately. "You're settling in all right?" he asked. "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "Caldwell does that," he said. "It looks rough at first, and then you find the parts of it that are actually quite decent, like Mrs. Hecht's bread." He smiled, and it transformed his face in a way that made her look at the ledger for a moment to regain her footing. "Exactly like that. I understand you're the foreman now at the Lachlan place," she said. "Going on 2 years," he said. "Jim Lachlan is getting older and his son is in Topeka becoming a lawyer, so," he shrugged. "The work suits me. I like knowing a place well." "What do you like about knowing it well?" The question surprised him. She could see that. It was more direct than polite small talk required, but he considered it genuinely. "You stop seeing it the way a stranger does," he said. "You start seeing the actual thing, the patterns of it. Which pasture holds water in a dry summer? How the cattle behave before a storm? Which hands are reliable and which ones will disappear on you? He paused. It's the difference between looking at something and understanding it. Esther thought of Clara, of the way Clara had understood her without needing explanation, the way she had always known when Esther was frightened beneath her calm, when she was hurting beneath her competence. Nobody since had understood her that way, and she was not sure anybody since could, because understanding like that required years and proximity and love. That sounds like something worth having, she said. It is, Edwin said. He turned his hat in his hands once. I'll see you Tuesday, Miss Redmond. Until Tuesday, Mr. Walden, she said. He left, and the bell above the door rang again, and Esther stood at the counter for a long moment looking at the thread she had sorted and the ledger she had written in and the ordinary afternoon light falling through the shop window, and she thought, with a feeling that was partly warmth and partly alarm, that she was in a great deal of trouble. She was living under her dead sister's name. Whatever this was becoming, whatever the Tuesday afternoons were beginning to suggest, was built on a foundation that was not true. This was the thought that came to her at night, lying in the narrow bed with the blue and white quilt pulled up around her shoulders, listening to the coyotes in the distance and the breathing of the house settling around her. She was Clara Redmond to everyone in Caldwell. She had been Clara Redmond for 2 months now. She had forgotten, in the small daily transactions of the post office and the shop and the dinner table, that it was not her name. And now there was a man who looked at her in a way that made her want to be known as herself, actually known, and she could not let that happen while she was wearing a dead woman's name. She told herself, with the severity of someone who has been allowing something to grow in secret, that it did not matter. That Edwin Walden was a foreman on a cattle ranch who was pleasant to her on Tuesday afternoons, and that was the sum total of it, and she was being ridiculous. She told herself this convincingly enough that she was almost surprised, the third Tuesday afternoon, when he stopped outside the sewing shop and looked in through the window, and catching her eye, gave that small, serious smile, and she felt it land somewhere in the center of her chest with the precision of a placed hand. It was in October, 5 months after her arrival, that the trouble began in earnest. Not the quiet trouble of her conscience, which had been there from the beginning, but the kind of trouble that arrived from outside, wearing the face of the past. His name was Douglas Hess. He came to Caldwell on a cattle drive from Texas, a man of perhaps 40, heavy through the shoulders, with small, sharp eyes and the particular self-assurance of someone who had never been held meaningfully accountable for anything. He was a drover, one of several dozen who came through with a herd that week, and he would have passed through entirely unremarked if he had not, on his second day in town, walked into the general store at the same moment Esther was at the counter buying needles. Stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "Well," he said with a slowness that made the word unpleasant, "Clara Redmond." Esther's heart went cold and still. She turned to face him and managed to keep her face neutral. She had never seen this man before in her life. She did not know how he knew her sister's name. "I'm sorry," she said. "Do we know each other?" Something moved in his face, surprise maybe or recalibration. "I knew your family some years back," he said. "In Ohio, I knew your father." Her father had been dead for 8 years. Esther did not know the name of every man her father had dealt with. There had been business associates, neighbors, men who owed debts or were owed them, and her father had not been a particularly careful man in terms of the company he kept. "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage," she said. "Douglas Hess," he said. "Your father owed me a considerable sum when he died. I've been trying to locate his family." He looked at her with those small, sharp eyes. "I had heard there were 2 daughters. Clara and another one." "My sister died," Esther said. The words were steady and absolutely true, and she was saying them about herself without meaning to, and the surreal doubling of it was dizzying. "In April, typhoid." Hess looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, in a tone that was not sorry at all. "The debt you're describing," Esther said carefully. "I'm not aware of any formal obligation. My father's estate was settled." "Not to my satisfaction," Hess said. And then, because he was not a subtle man, "I'd hate for a young woman alone in a new town to have her reputation complicated by stories about her family." The threat was not even dressed up. It was bare and ugly, and it sat between them in the general store like a stone on a clean floor. "I think," Esther said, "that I need to finish my shopping, Mr. Hess." She turned back to the counter. Her hands were entirely steady, which she was proud of because she felt nothing like steady on the inside. Hess bought what he was buying and left, and the storekeeper, a young man named Arthur who had the grace to pretend he had heard nothing, wrapped her needles in paper and charged her the right amount, and she walked back to the boarding house in the October afternoon with the particular focused calm of someone who is deciding what to do. What she decided that evening after dinner was that she needed to tell Hattie the truth. Not about Hess, not yet, but about the name. The Hess situation was a separate and manageable problem. The name was the one that mattered, that had been mattering for months, that had been pressing against the inside of her chest every time someone called her Clara, and she answered without correcting them. She knocked on the door of Hattie's private sitting room after the other boarders had retired, and when Hattie said to come in, she went in and sat down in the chair across from her landlady and said, without preamble, because Hattie deserved directness, "My name is not Clara." Hattie looked at her over the top of the mending in her lap. She did not look surprised. She looked like a woman who had been waiting. "My name is Esther," Esther said. "Esther Redmond. Clara was my sister. She died in April of typhoid fever, and she had been corresponding with you about coming here, and when she died I was alone and I had nothing, and I took her letters. I answered them as her. I came here wearing her name, and I know that is a deception, and I am sorry." Hattie put down the mending. The silence lasted long enough that Esther began to prepare herself for being asked to leave. "How old was she?" Hattie asked. Esther blinked. 27. Hattie nodded slowly. "What was she like?" The question was so unexpected, so generous, that Esther felt her throat tighten. "She was braver than me," she said. "She was the one who wanted to come west. She was funny, and she talked too fast when she was excited, and she grew flowers indoors because she said there was no reason not to have them year-round." She paused. "She was the person I talked to about everything." "And then she was gone," Hattie said. "And then she was gone," Esther agreed. Another silence. "You do good work," Hattie said. "Better than I expected." "Hattie, I knew there was something off," Hattie said plainly. "You were too careful with the name, like it didn't sit quite naturally. I noticed it the first week." She picked up her mending again. "I figured you had your reasons and you'd tell me when you were ready." Esther stared at her. "You knew." "I suspected," Hattie corrected. "There's a difference." She looked up. "I'm not turning you out, Esther. I like the person who has been living under that name. I'd like to get to know you properly under your own." Esther put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying exactly. Something more like the physical sensation of a knot loosening after months of being tied. "There's a man named Douglas Hess in town," she said when she had collected herself. "He was on the cattle drive. He claims my father owed him money." Hattie's expression sharpened. "Hess," she said with recognition. "He came through 2 years ago. He has a reputation for preying on people who can't fight back. Whatever your father might or might not have owed him, I would not take his claim at face value. He implied he would spread stories about my family." "Did he?" Hattie said it flat, without the upward inflection that would make it a question. "You should tell Edwin." Esther opened her mouth, closed it. "I don't see why, because Edwin Walden knows this territory and he knows the law and he has the sheriff's ear," Hattie said. "And because he has been coming into my sewing shop with interfacing requests and button orders that no sensible foreman needs personally, and I think you know that already." She looked at Esther with those direct gray eyes. "Tell him your real name first." Esther walked home from the Tuesday errands the following week by a slightly different route, one that took her past the livery stable where she knew Edwin's horse was tied, and she was not entirely surprised to find him coming out of the stable at the same moment, because the territory was not, in the end, so very large. "Miss Redmond," he said, and then stopped, because something in her face must have been visible. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I would rather tell you somewhere that isn't the middle of the street." He looked at her steadily. "All right," he said. They walked to the small park area behind the church, which had a bench under an elm tree that was still holding its October leaves, most of them a color between gold and rust. He sat on the bench and she stood because she thought she might need to be able to move. "My name is Esther," she said. "Not Clara. My sister was Clara. She died. I came here under her name because I was desperate and frightened and I had no plan for what my life was supposed to be." Edwin listened. She told him all of it. The typhoid, the letters, the landlord, the trunk and the stagecoach, and the name in the passenger registry. She told him because he was looking at her the way he had described looking at the land he loved, with the intention of seeing the actual thing, and she wanted to be the actual thing even if it cost her. When she finished, the leaves moved overhead in the October wind and a horse whinnied somewhere distant and the town went on doing what it was doing. Which one was heavier? Edwin asked. She looked at him, puzzled. "The name," he said, "or the grief?" The question was so precise that it stopped her completely. She had not thought of it in those terms, but now that he had named it, she understood that he had understood something essential, that she had been carrying both, and that they were not the same weight. "The grief," she said, "always the grief. The name was just a way to keep moving." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the elm tree. "My mother died when I was 12, he said. "My father dealt with it by working harder. I dealt with it by going further west each time I needed to stop thinking about it. Missouri wasn't far enough. Kansas was further." He paused. "I understand keeping yourself moving." "Are you angry?" she asked. "That I wasn't honest about who I was?" He looked at her. "I'm not angry," he said. "I think you were a person in an impossible situation who made a practical decision. I think you've been carrying the dishonesty of it as a burden, not as a comfort, which is the difference that matters." He turned his hat in his hands, and she recognized the gesture now as his particular tell, the thing he did when he was about to say something important. "I would like to know Esther Redmond." She sat down on the bench. "You should also know," she said, "about Douglas Hess." She told him about that too, the meeting in the general store, the implied threat. His expression while she spoke was controlled, but she could see the shift in it, a tightening around the jaw, a stillness. "He's still in town," Edwin said. "The drive leaves Friday." "I'll speak to the sheriff today," Edwin said. "Hess has a history of this kind of thing. The sheriff knows him." He paused. "He won't make good on any threat if he understands there are people here who are watching." "I don't want to be the kind of person who needs other people to fight her battles," Esther said. "You're not asking me to fight your battle," Edwin said. "You're allowing someone to stand beside you while you fight it. There's a meaningful difference." She looked at him. The October light was doing something particular to his face, bringing out the angles of it, the seriousness in his eyes that was not severity but was rather a kind of honesty she recognized because she had been trying to practice it herself. "You called me Esther just now," she said. "That's your name," he said. She felt it, hearing her own name in his voice. Not the practiced answer to Clara, not the shape of a borrowed identity. Esther, her name. The name her mother had given her on a cold Ohio morning in 1853. The name Clara had called her in the particular way that only sisters did. The name she had been setting aside for months like something fragile she could not afford to break. "Yes," she said, "it is." Edwin spoke to Sheriff Dane Calloway that afternoon. Calloway was a capable man of middle age who had been the law in Caldwell long enough to know every variety of grifter and extortionist that the cattle trail sent through, and when Edwin described the situation, the sheriff's expression went from interested to recognizing within about 30 seconds. "Hess," Calloway said, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah. He tried something similar in Abilene 2 years back. Had some supposed debt claim against a widow." He shook his head. "He knows better than to make formal legal claims because he can't back them up. He operates in the implication space. Scares people who don't know they can push back. Miss Redmond is not someone I would describe as easily scared," Edwin said. "No," Calloway agreed. "But she's alone, she's new here, and she doesn't know her rights yet," he stood. "I'll pay Hess a visit this evening, make the situation clear. I'd appreciate that." Calloway did pay Hess a visit, and whatever was said during that visit had the intended effect, because Douglas Hess left Caldwell with the rest of the cattle drive on Friday morning and was not heard from again. Whether the claims about the debt were fabricated entirely or were based on some real but long-settled obligation of Esther's father, she never knew and found, eventually, that she did not need to. The threat had dissolved before it could consolidate into anything, and the particular weight it had added to her days went with it. What remained was the fact of herself. She told Miss Fry her real name over breakfast on a Saturday morning, braced for surprise or confusion, but Miss Fry only tilted her head and said, "Esther is nicer actually. It suits you better," with the breezy practicality of someone for whom names were mostly interesting rather than weighted, and then asked if Esther would help her with a hook-and-eye situation on a dress, and that was that. Mr. Pell and Mr. Carmichael were told over dinner, and received the information with the tolerance of men who had more pressing things on their minds, namely, in Carmichael's case, a cattle transaction that was consuming his every waking thought. Hattie, at the head of the table, watched these revelations with the expression of someone who had staged them. The question of Edwin was different, because Edwin already knew, and because knowing changed the nature of the Tuesday afternoon conversations in a way Esther was still adjusting to. There was a directness to them now that had not been there before, or rather there had been a directness, but it had been muted by the knowledge that she was not presenting herself honestly, and now that the obstruction was gone the directness was present in its full form, and it was, she did not have the word for it except to say that it was like stepping from a room into the outdoors, the particular expansion of air and light. He asked her about Ohio, about her childhood, her father's business, which had been dry goods, her mother's death when Esther was 18 and Clara 20, the 7 years the two sisters had kept house together, working as seamstresses, economizing carefully, Clara's plans and dreams that were always bigger than their circumstances. She asked him about Missouri, about what had made him leave, about the particular progression west that he had described, the way each mile had been a kind of response to something. He told her about a family spread that had not been profitable enough to sustain, a younger brother who had stayed and worked it, letters that still came from Missouri with news of people and places that felt increasingly distant. He told her about arriving in Kansas with $40 and a good horse and enough stubbornness to turn that into something, and she listened to the way he told it, not with pride exactly, but with the particular satisfaction of a person who has made something from actual material and knows what the making cost. They began, in late October, to take walks after dinner on the evenings when Edwin was in town late enough for dinner to be relevant. This was not every day, perhaps twice a week, and it was perfectly public and thoroughly unremarkable by the standards of Caldwell, which had opinions about most things but was pragmatic about its own business. Hattie observed it without comment, though once, cutting fabric in the shop while Esther was hemming at the table nearby, she said, in the tone of someone completing a thought they had been having privately, "Edwin Walden is the most reliable man in this county," and left it there, which was more than enough. It was on the second walk in November, when the evenings had turned cold enough that Esther's breath showed in the air, that Edwin stopped walking and turned to face her and said, with the directness that she now recognized as the purest form of respect he knew how to show, "I would like to court you properly, Esther, if that is something you want." The elm tree they were standing under had lost its leaves entirely now, and the branches were bare against the dark blue of the evening sky, and somewhere behind them Caldwell was lit with lamplight, and the sound of a piano drifting from one of the saloons, and the coyotes were calling somewhere in the distance the way they always were. "Yes," she said, "I want that." He reached out and took her hand, and they stood there in the cold evening under the bare elm tree, and it was one of the most quietly powerful moments of Esther's life, not because anything dramatic was happening, but because nothing was hidden. She was Esther Redmond, 25 years old, seamstress, daughter of an Ohio dry goods merchant, sister of a dead woman she would grieve forever herself, standing in the Kansas Territory in November 1878 with her hand in the hand of a man who had asked which of her burdens was heavier, because he had wanted to understand them both. Clara would have loved this, she thought. Clara would have been unbearably smug about the westward trajectory being the right choice and would have talked about it at volume for the rest of her days. The thought made her smile, and the smile was the kind that had grief woven into it but was still, genuinely, a smile. "What are you thinking about?" Edwin asked. "My sister," she said. "She would have liked you." "I'm glad," he said. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was hard in Kansas, the way that winters in Kansas regularly were, with a particular indifference to human plans and preferences that the territory seemed to specialize in. Snow came early in December and lay on the ground without thawing, and the temperature dropped to levels that made walking anywhere a project requiring preparation. The cattle work did not stop for weather. It became more demanding instead, more vigilant, more relentless, and Edwin was often at the ranch for stretches of 4 and 5 days without coming into town. Esther's work in the shop increased in inverse proportion to the outdoor temperature, because cold weather meant people spending more time indoors, which meant noticing what needed mending or replacing, and the sewing orders stacked up in a way that was satisfying rather than oppressive. She had a good working rhythm with Hattie now, a mutual respect that had deepened into something she recognized as genuine friendship, the kind that grew between women who had decided to be honest with each other. She wrote letters, not false ones, not this time. She wrote to her father's sister in Ohio, the only remaining family she had, and told her honestly where she was and who she was becoming, and received back a letter that was cautious but not unkind, which was more than she had hoped for. She wrote in a journal that Hattie had given her for Christmas, a small leather-bound book with unlined pages, and she wrote Clara's name in it often, not as a summons but as a presence, a way of keeping the conversation going that death had interrupted. Edwin sent a note from the ranch in December, delivered by one of the hands who came into town for supplies. The note said, "The North Pasture Creek has frozen solid for the first time in 6 years. It is remarkable. I wish you could see it." "EW," she wrote back, "I would like to see it when the weather allows. He came to dinner on Christmas Eve." Hattie set the table with a cloth and candles, which was not the usual arrangement, and all the boarders were present, and there was a roasted chicken that had been a gift from Mr. Lachlan, who was generous to the people who worked his land. The evening was warm and lamplit, and full of the ordinary conversation of people who had shared a table long enough to be comfortable, and Edwin sat across from Esther and they talked easily, and looked at each other with the particular look of people who are in the middle of discovering something important and know it. After dinner, when the other boarders had moved to the parlor and Hattie was occupied with washing up, they stood on the front porch in the cold and the dark, wrapped against the weather, and he put his arm around her shoulders in a way that was careful and certain at the same time, and she leaned into it with a readiness that surprised her, because she had not known she was leaning toward anything until she was already doing it. "I want to say something," he said. "Say it." "I think about you a great deal," he said. "When I'm out at the ranch, working the cattle, riding the fence line, eating dinner with the hands, it's like having a light on somewhere in the back of your mind. You're aware of it even when you're not looking at it directly." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of his arm across her shoulders and the cold air on her face and the particular quality of the dark December night around them. "I know that feeling," she said. "I was not expecting to know it again. I thought I was done with hope for a while. Were you?" I was very carefully managing my expectations, she said, and the humor in it was real, which was another thing she had not expected to recover, the capacity to find herself slightly funny. He laughed, soft and low. She felt it through his arm. I'm not an easy man to know, he said. I'm particular about things. I can be quiet in ways that people read wrong. I work long hours and sometimes I come into town with my head still half in the work, and it takes me a while to be entirely present. I'm a woman living in a borrowed town with a borrowed name that I've been trying to make my own, she said. I have been sad in ways I don't always show. I keep things inside longer than is probably useful. I'm not particularly good at asking for what I need. We can work on that together, he said. Is that a proposal? She asked. He looked down at her. His face in the dark was very close and very serious. It is a statement of intention, he said. All right, she said. I accept the intention. He pressed a kiss to her temple, careful and warm, and she closed her eyes against the cold December night and felt something she had been afraid to call by its name become unmistakably itself. The winter passed, as winters do, with a combination of endurance and incremental warmth. By February, the snow was retreating from the prairie in patches, and the light was returning in the particular way it did on the Great Plains, not gently but all at once, flooding the landscape with a yellow clarity that made everything look more actual than it had in the gray months. The cattle were getting through the winter with their numbers largely intact, which was always a worry, and always a relief when it proved unfounded. Edwin came to town with a regularity that Caldwell noted and filed under its running account of local affairs without much commentary, because the town was occupied with its own concerns. A new general store was opening on the south end of the main street, which was either a sign of prosperity or an excess of optimism, depending on who you asked. There was a dispute about a water access right between two neighboring farms that was going through the land office and consuming Mr. Pell's professional attention entirely. Miss Fry had received a proposal from a music teacher in Junction City and was in an agony of indecision about it that she shared freely with Esther during their shared morning routines. "Do you love him?" Esther asked one February morning at the washstand. "I like him very much," Miss Fry said. "He's kind and he has a steady income and he's not unpleasant to look at." "But do you love him?" Miss Fry looked at herself in the mirror. She was a fair-haired woman with a naturally optimistic face that was currently doing its best to accommodate doubt. "I think I could," she said. "That's probably enough to begin with," Esther said, and meant it. Miss Fry accepted the proposal in March and moved to Junction City in April with a wagon full of possessions and a look of nervous excitement that Esther recognized from her own stagecoach arrival in Caldwell, the look of someone who has jumped and is still determining whether the landing will hold. The boarding house received a new boarder in Miss Fry's place, a young woman named Della Morrow, who had come up from Texas and was apprenticing with the printer who ran the Caldwell paper, which was a sufficiently unusual occupation for a woman that it generated considerable local discussion. Della was energetic and opinionated and did not particularly care about the discussion, which Esther found refreshing. It was Della, in fact, who said the thing that clarified what Esther had been circling for months. They were in the sewing shop on a Thursday morning, Esther working on a dress order and Della having stopped in to have a tear in her jacket seen to, and Della, who was not constrained by conventional conversational pacing, said, "You and the foreman, Walden, you're serious about each other." "We are," Esther said. "Good," Della said, with the efficiency of someone checking an item off a list. "You should be. He looks at you like you're the only stable feature in a variable landscape." Esther paused with the needle halfway through the fabric. "That's a very specific observation." "I am a specific person," Della said. "Also, I sit at the window at dinner. I see things." She looked at the jacket in her hands. "He's waiting for you to tell him something, I think. He's been careful with you, like he knows there's something you need to work through and he doesn't want to rush it." Esther thought about this. She had been working through it. All winter, through the cold weeks and the long evenings and the letters sent across 6 miles of frozen Kansas pasture, she had been working through it. The grief for Clara had not diminished, would not diminish, would be there her whole life as a sort of fundamental frequency beneath everything else. But she had stopped carrying it as an excuse. She had stopped carrying it as a reason for not fully inhabiting her own life, her own name, her own future. Clara had wanted to come west. Clara had been brave and fast-talking and full of plans that were always just larger than the circumstances allowed. And Clara was gone. But Esther was here, in the place Clara had dreamed of, and she was not her sister and could not be and had never been, but she was herself, and she was beginning to understand that being herself was actually quite enough. She finished Della's jacket that morning, and in the afternoon she wrote a letter. Not to Edwin, not a letter that would go by post or by hand, but a letter to Clara. She wrote it in the leather journal Hattie had given her. She wrote about Caldwell and the wide sky and Mrs. Heck's bread and the elm tree behind the church with its autumn leaves. She wrote about Hattie and Della and the particular way the prairie looked in February when the light came back. She wrote about Edwin. She wrote, "He asked me which was heavier, the name or the grief, and he was the first person since you died who asked me something real. I think you would have liked him enormously and told me so at considerable volume. I am going to be all right, Clara. I am going to be more than all right." She closed the journal. That Tuesday, when Edwin came to town, she met him at the general store and said, "Would you take me to see the ranch?" He looked at her. "The ranch?" "The frozen creek," she said. "I know it's thawed by now, but the place, I want to see where you work." He was quiet for a moment with the quality of stillness he had when something mattered. "Saturday," he said. "I'll come for you at 9. He came at 9 on Saturday with a light wagon, because the ground was too muddy from the spring thaw for a comfortable ride on horseback, and they drove out of Caldwell on the eastern road with the April sky above them doing what April skies in Kansas did, performing a kind of operatic cycle of cloud and light that made the landscape look different every 15 minutes. She asked him questions about the land as they drove. He answered them with the specificity of someone who had looked at a thing long enough to know it from every angle. Which creek ran through the south corner of the property? How many hands the ranch employed and where they had come from? The particular challenge of keeping cattle through a hard winter. The way the Lachlan herd had been built up over 20 years from a starting stock of 40 animals. "Do you want a place of your own?" she asked. Eventually. He was quiet for a moment, watching the horses. "I've thought about it," he said. "There's land available. The Homestead Act made it accessible to most people in theory. In practice it takes capital I'm still accumulating." He paused. "And it takes knowing what you're building it for." She understood that he meant something specific by this. She understood it completely. The ranch came into view as they crested a low rise, a cluster of buildings in a natural hollow that provided some shelter from the northwest wind. A main house, a bunkhouse, a large barn, outbuildings, and the pastures spreading out from it in every direction with cattle scattered across them like a pattern of thought. The creek, now fully thawed, ran along the eastern edge of the nearest pasture, catching the April light. Edwin helped her down from the wagon and gave her a tour of the place with the ease of someone who is comfortable being known in his own context, showing her the barn and its organized practical interior, introducing her to the hands who were working, all of whom greeted her with the straightforward courtesy of men who had clearly been briefed on nothing, but who understood from Edwin's manner that she mattered. The last thing he showed her was the creek. It was not remarkable as creeks went. It was perhaps 8 feet across at its widest, running fast and clear with the spring melt, bordered by a thin line of cottonwoods that were just starting to show their first green. But he stood beside it with his hands in his pockets and his face turned toward it, and she understood that this was the place he had described in the letter, the frozen thing, the remarkable thing. "I thought about you when I sent that note," he said. "You thought about me often," she said. "You told me. I wanted you to see the things I found worth seeing," he said. "That's a particular kind of wanting." She stood beside him at the creek and watched the water run. The cottonwoods were rustling in the April wind. The cattle in the pasture moved with the slow purpose of animals following the warmth of the sun across the grass. "Edwin," she said. "Yes. I am not who I was when I got off that stagecoach." "I know," he said. "I was wearing so much," she said. The name and the grief and she paused, looking for the word. The sense that I didn't have the right to want anything for myself because I was already in debt to circumstances. The guilt of surviving her. The guilt of using her name even if it was out of necessity. All of it. "How much of it are you still wearing?" he asked. She considered this with the genuine seriousness it deserved. "The grief," she said. "I'll always carry that, but it's mine now. Not something I'm hiding from or running toward, just mine." She looked at him. "The rest I've been putting down for a while." Bit by bit, he turned toward her. They were standing very close, the creek sound between them and the cottonwoods overhead. "Esther Redmond," he said. "Edwin Walden," she said. "I love you," he said, and the directness of it was so characteristic of him, so without preamble or protective irony, that it landed cleanly, the way true things do. She felt it go through her like the first warm day after a hard winter, that particular physical quality of warmth that is also relief. "I love you," she said. "I have been trying not to say that for a while because I wasn't sure I had finished becoming myself yet." "Are you finished?" "I don't think people are ever finished," she said. "But I think I'm enough of myself to know what I want." He put his hands on either side of her face, and the gentleness of it was precise, careful and absolutely intentional, the way he did everything. He kissed her there beside the creek on the Lachlan Ranch in April of 1879, with the cottonwoods rustling and the cattle moving through the pasture and the Kansas sky above them doing its restless, theatrical work. And she held onto the front of his coat with both hands and kissed him back with the full force of a woman who has been keeping herself in reserve for too long and has decided, definitively, to stop. When they drove back to Caldwell in the late afternoon, he asked her if she would allow him to speak to Hattie. "About what?" she asked. He looked at her from the corner of his eye. "Oh," she said. Then, "Yes." He spoke to Hattie that evening while Esther sat in the parlor with Della and Mr. Pell and Mr. Carmichael, and pretended to read a book that she did not turn the pages of. And when Edwin came into the parlor and met her eyes, the look on his face was the one she had been learning to read all winter, serious and warm and entirely without concealment. He proposed on the porch, where they had stood in December in the dark and cold. It was April now, and the evening was soft, and he went down on one knee on the boarding house porch in the fading April light, which was, she reflected, both more dramatic and more deeply sincere than she had expected of him. He held her hand and he asked her, and she looked down at his face, this man who had carried her trunk and asked the right questions and given her space to become herself. And she said yes with a conviction that was not the breathless yes of a fairy story, but was rather the grounded, bone-deep yes of someone who has understood something important. Hattie gave them a bottle of wine that had been in her cellar since her husband brought it from St. Louis, years before he died. They drank it at the dinner table with all the boarders present, and Mr. Carmichael made a toast that was primarily about cattle but ended with something genuinely warm, and Della raised her glass with the directness that was her most characteristic quality, and Mr. Pell put down his book for the entirety of the proceedings, which was, from him, an exceptional tribute. They were married in June. The wedding was at the church on the south end of Caldwell's Main Street, a white frame building with a bell that actually worked, which was a point of local pride. The ceremony was performed by a minister who had been in Caldwell for 2 years and had the practical warmth of a man accustomed to performing ceremonies for people whose lives were being built from scratch on new ground. The congregation was small because their circle of close acquaintances was small, but it was full of people who were genuinely glad, and that was the thing that mattered. Hattie gave Esther away, which was her own decision, and was offered with such matter-of-fact directness that Esther had found herself unable to speak for a moment before managing to say yes. Esther wore a dress she had made herself over the winter months, a cream-colored cotton with a fitted bodice and long sleeves, and a collar of fine lace that had been a gift from Hattie's own reserve of fine fabrics. Clara would have said it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen and then immediately begun suggesting embellishments. And Esther thought this with a smile as she stood in front of the mirror in her room at the boarding house for the last time on a June morning that was blue and clear and entirely perfect. Edwin stood at the front of the church in a good dark jacket that was clearly new, with his hat not present because it was the kind of occasion that did not require it. And when she walked up the aisle with Hattie beside her, he looked at her with an expression that she catalogued carefully, intending to keep it. Pure, uncomplicated joy, the kind that has no arithmetic in it. They said the words. He put a ring on her finger, a simple gold band that he had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita, and that had arrived 2 days before the wedding with a letter confirming it was the right size. The letter having been based on him having measured the circumference of her ring finger while she was focused on a sewing project, and he was pretending to look at something else, which she had known about at the time, and had chosen to find endearing rather than presumptuous. After the ceremony, they walked out of the church into the June sunshine, and Caldwell went about its business around them with its customary indifference. And it did not matter, because they were the main event of their own lives. They had supper at the hotel, the Drover's Rest, which had a dining room that served decent food and had been made particularly decent for the evening by arrangement with the cook. Hattie and Della and the Lachlan Ranch hands who were closest to Edwin came, and there was food and wine, and a fiddle player who sat up in the corner and played for 2 hours without stopping. And Esther danced with Edwin for the first time in the center of the hotel dining room, while everyone watched with the particular warmth of people who are genuinely happy for 2 people they like. She put her hand on his shoulder and he put his hand on her waist, and they moved together with the easy competence of people who have learned to read each other, not perfectly in step but perfectly in tune, which was better. "Mrs. Walden," he said, testing it. "I keep both names," she said. "Esther Redmond Walden. That's a lot of name." "I have a lot of history," she said. He smiled. "Yes, you do." They lived, for the first year of their marriage, in the foreman's house on the Lachlan Ranch. It was small and practical and full of windows, which Esther liked, and it had a porch facing east where the morning light was good, and where she put flower boxes and planted black-eyed Susans because there was, as Clara had always said, no reason not to have flowers year-round when they could be managed. She continued her work with Hattie's shop, riding into town on Tuesdays and Thursdays with a dependability that eventually made the ride itself feel like a meditation. The 6 miles of Kansas road in every variety of weather, the approach to Caldwell, the particular comfort of the shop in Hattie's company, and the work that she was good at. Edwin was a good husband. Not in the idealized, untested way of fictional men, but in the practical, specific way of a man who had decided to be one. He asked her opinion, and he listened to the answer. He was quiet sometimes in ways she had learned to read correctly, not as absence but as depth, the way still water was deep rather than empty. He woke early and worked hard and came home tired but present. He was funny in a way that took a while to notice, dry and precise, the kind of humor that earned its laugh rather than demanding it. He learned what she needed without her always having to say it, which was one of the things she had identified as a personal weakness, the asking, and he was patient with it without indulging it, because there was a difference between patience and enabling, and he understood the difference. She learned what he needed too, the space after a hard day that was not silence but was a different kind of communication. The practical satisfaction he took from work done well, and how that satisfaction needed to be witnessed rather than praised. The way he felt about land, about knowing a place and being trusted with it. She wrote to her father's sister in Ohio regularly now, true letters under her own name, and received letters back that were warming gradually from cautious to warm, the ice of an old estrangement thawing slowly but steadily. The aunt had known Clara too, and was glad to hear that someone had carried her dream westward, even if not in the way anyone had planned. The territory itself was changing, as it had been changing all through those years, with the relentless momentum of westward settlement pressing against the edge of what had been before. Esther observed this with the particular attention of someone who had arrived as an outsider and was now something closer to a witness. She saw the cattle industry that made Caldwell what it was, saw its prosperity and its ugliness both. She saw the men who profited and the men who worked for wages and the significant difference in their positions. She saw the way the land was changing under the pressure of more and more homesteads, the prairie being broken up into farms, which was progress by one definition and loss by another. The Cherokee Strip to the south was land that had been designated for the Cherokee people, and there was already pressure to open it to white settlers, the same pressure that had displaced and dispossessed one group after another as the frontier moved west. Esther had no political power to change this, but she had clear eyes, and she had a husband who also had clear eyes, and they spoke honestly to each other about the injustices that were visible in the landscape around them, about the particular way that the promise of the West was kept for some people and withheld from others on the basis of who they were. She thought about Clara sometimes in these moments, about how Clara had imagined the West, all wide sky and possibility, and how the reality of it was that the sky was genuinely wide but the possibility was unevenly distributed, and what it meant to be grateful for the portion you had received while knowing others had received nothing. In the spring of 1880, Esther discovered she was expecting a child. She told Edwin on a Thursday evening, sitting on the east porch in the April evening with the black-eyed Susans she had planted the previous year coming up in the boxes again, perennial and reliable. She said it plainly, because she had learned that plainness was the right currency for important things. He was very still for a moment, in the way he was still when something reached him in a deep place. Then he turned to her, and his face was doing several things at once, joy and something that was very close to awe and a particular tender solemnity. And she saw all of it clearly because she had learned to read his face the way he had taught her to read the land, by patient attention and genuine investment. He put his hand very carefully over hers, and she turned her hand and held his, and they sat on the porch in the April evening and listened to the Kansas night begin around them. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me. I want to name him or her," he began and paused. "Is there a name that matters to you, that you would want to give?" She thought of Clara. Of course she thought of Clara. "Not as a first name," she said. "The first name should be theirs, but Clara as a middle name if it's a girl." She paused. "And if it's a boy, James. That was my father's name before he was everything that went wrong." "James it is," Edwin said, "if it's a boy." The pregnancy was not easy by the standards of 1880, which were not the gentle standards of later times. There was a period in the summer when the heat was unpleasant, and the nausea was worse, and Hattie came out to the ranch on 2 separate occasions to sit with her and manage things, with the practical competence of a woman who had seen pregnancies in comfortable circumstances, and in difficult ones, and knew the difference between needing medical attention and needing someone present. The doctor in Caldwell, a relatively young man named Dr. Weiss who had trained in St. Louis, was careful and thorough, and had the good sense not to be condescending, which was not universal among doctors of the era and which Esther appreciated significantly. Edwin was attentive in the way that he was attentive to all things that mattered to him, with the full weight of his focus and without drama. He worried quietly and managed the worry by being useful, which was exactly the right approach. He modified his schedule to come home earlier when the summer was at its most unforgiving. He asked the right questions and listened to the answers, and deferred to Esther's own understanding of her body with a respect that she found, each time, newly moving. The baby came in November, On a morning that was cold and gray and still, with a light dusting of snow on the ground, and the ranch dogs quiet in the yard, and the cattle settled in the winter pasture. Hattie was present. Dr. Weiss was present. Edwin was present, which was not the universal custom for husbands of the period, but Edwin was not particularly interested in universal custom when it conflicted with what he believed was right, and he believed that his wife should not be alone in that room, and so he was there. The baby was a boy. He was born with a great deal of hair, and a loud opinion about the world that he expressed immediately and at volume, which both the doctor and Hattie took as a positive sign, and which Edwin received with the particular wondering look of a man who is being presented with something he has no prior experience of, and is therefore experiencing purely for the first time. James Edwin Walden. Esther held him in the November morning light, this small, loud, certain person, and felt the weight of him in her arms with a quality of feeling that she could not have described before experiencing it. It was love, obviously, the full and uncomplicated variety, but it was also something else, a kind of recognition, as though this was a person she had in some sense known the shape of already and was now meeting face to face. "Hello, James," she said. James expressed another opinion loudly. "That's fair," Edwin said softly from beside her. "It's a lot to process." She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that comes from absolute happiness, the unguarded kind, the kind Clara would have recognized and rejoiced in. Edwin touched his son's hand with one finger, and James, with the arbitrary decisiveness of newborns, grabbed it and held on. Edwin went very still in the way that meant something had reached him where he lived. "Hello," he said, very quietly, to the small person who had just rearranged the world. Hattie, in the doorway, had the expression of a woman who has managed not to cry for decades through the strategic application of practicality, and is currently engaged in that strategy with her full resources. "I'll make tea," she said, and went. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was the winter of the baby, and the adjustment to having the baby, which was its own education. James was a forthright child with strong preferences, and the temperament of someone who had arrived with opinions already formed. He slept when he chose to sleep and expressed himself when he chose otherwise, and the sleep deprivation of the early months was both worse and stranger than Esther had anticipated. Strange because it coexisted with a quality of joy that made the whole difficult enterprise feel like something she was doing willingly and not reluctantly. Edwin was, with the baby, as he was with the land he managed, attentive and practical and increasingly expert. He learned James with the same patient investment he applied to everything he cared about, learning which cry meant hunger and which meant discomfort, learning the particular way James settled when held against a shoulder, learning the early signals of a happy mood versus one that was about to turn. He was present in the night shifts without being asked, because it had not occurred to him that he should not be. Della came from Caldwell on horseback in January to visit, bringing a present for James that she had made herself, a small quilted square in yellow and white that she presented with the matter-of-fact manner of someone who has no interest in making a production of generosity. She stayed for dinner and held the baby and talked to Esther with the particular ease of a friendship that had developed in the context of honest daily life, and when she left in the late afternoon, Esther felt the warmth of being known by people who knew her actual name and her actual history. The Lachlan Ranch had, by the spring of 1881, a new consideration on the horizon. Mr. Lachlan, now in his middle 60s and in declining health, had begun the conversation that Edwin had been expecting for some time, the conversation about the future of the operation and who would run it and in what capacity. His son in Topeka was a lawyer with no intention of returning to ranching. The ranch would need to be sold or managed by someone who could buy into it over time. Edwin came home from a long conversation with Mr. Lachlan in March with the particular expression he had when he was processing something large, and did not want to speak about it until he had thought it through. Esther gave him the evening and the dinner and the after-dinner hour on the porch with James sleeping inside, and when he was ready, he told her. "Lachlan wants to sell the property in parcels," Edwin said. "He's offered me the option to purchase the house and the nearest 200 acres at a price that reflects what I've put into this place over the years. It's manageable. With what we have and what I could borrow against the equipment." He paused. "I wanted to talk to you before I answered him." Esther considered the question before her. It was their home already in all the ways that mattered. The east-facing porch and the black-eyed Susans and the creek 6 miles away that she had seen frozen in winter and thawed in spring, and had watched in every season since. It was the place James had been born, the place where Edwin's care and competence had built something lasting over 6 years before she arrived, and had been building something different and more important in the 3 years since. "This is home," she said. "If we can manage it, we should." He looked at her with the Creekwater eyes. "You're certain?" "I am very certain," she said. "Edwin, this is home." He reached across and put his hand over hers on the porch rail, and they looked out at the prairie in the March evening, the land that was theirs in the sense that mattered, the sense of knowing it well and being known by it, and the paperwork could follow. The purchase was completed over the course of the spring and summer of 1881. Which involved a significant amount of correspondence with Topeka, and a period of financial tension that was managed by careful attention, and by the relief of Esther's sewing work, bringing in a consistent income that she had never stopped regarding as her own contribution to the household. She expanded her work during this period, taking on orders from women on neighboring farms and ranches who had heard of her skill, and the additional income was modest but real, and it mattered. By the autumn of 1881, the property was theirs. Edwin Walden's name on a deed for 200 acres of Kansas land and the house that stood on it. And beside it, because she had asked and he had agreed without hesitation, Esther Redmond Walden's name as well, because the land was as much hers as his, because she had stood on it and worked beside it and raised a child in it, and because he understood without needing to be extensively persuaded that what was built together should be held together. James turned 1 in November of 1881, and the party for it was small but genuinely festive, with Hattie and Della and 2 of the hands' wives who had become friends of Esther's over the preceding year, and James himself celebrated with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had discovered that cake was a category of thing that existed in the world. Caldwell was changing. The cattle drives were beginning their long, slow decline as the railroads expanded, and the need to trail cattle north from Texas diminished. The town was evolving from a purely cattle industry settlement into something with more permanence, more institutional depth, the kind of town that stays rather than the kind that rises and falls with a single industry. Esther watched this evolution with interest, because it was the evolution of a place she now belonged to. And belonging, she had learned, was a relationship that required attention and participation. She had become, by the early 1880s, a reliable presence in Caldwell's social fabric in the way that women who did consistent, visible work became reliable presences. The sewing shop was known across the county now. She taught a mending class on Saturday mornings for the women of the area who wanted to learn, which had started with 4 students and grown to 12, and the growing was the kind that happened because people told other people about something real and useful. In 1883, the second child arrived. She was a girl, born in a late summer evening with the grasshoppers singing outside and the heat still heavy in the air, and she came into the world with a quieter disposition than her brother, looking around the room with dark eyes that took everything in before committing to an opinion. Clara. The middle name, used as a first name after all, because when Esther held her for the first time and looked into those serious dark eyes, the only name in her mind was Clara, and she said it aloud, and Edwin beside her said yes, without any need for further discussion. Clara Jane Walden. Jane for Edwin's mother, the woman he had lost at 12, the woman whose absence had set him in motion toward the west. Two names of lost women, carried forward into a new life. Two losses transformed by the ordinary miracle of time into inheritance. "Hello, Clara," Esther said, holding her second child in the evening light. The baby looked at her with serious dark eyes. Hattie, who had been present again because wild horses could not have kept Hattie away, said, "She has a look about her." "What kind of look?" Edwin asked. "The kind that means she knows things," Hattie said, in the tone of someone who is both joking and entirely serious. James, who was 2 years old and had opinions about the new arrival that oscillated between intense suspicion and genuine curiosity, examined the baby at close range, and then announced that she was small, which was accurate, and then went back to the quilt on the floor where he had been building something with wooden blocks, which was also exactly right. The years that followed had the quality of years that are full rather than eventful, full in the sense that something is happening in every part of them, work and growth and weather, and the changing face of a child, and then 2 children, and the steady deepening of a marriage that was past its first intensities, and into something more durable and more sustaining. James at 3 and 4 and 5 was a physical child, always moving, always testing the world for its structural limits, with his father's dark hair and his mother's Ohio practicality, and a stubbornness that appeared to be entirely his own invention. He followed Edwin around the property with the devotion of a small apprentice, learning the vocabulary of the land in the way children learn what surrounds them, organically and completely, so that by the time he was 5 he could name the cattle and the pastures and the tools in the barn with the same fluency he named his own fingers. Clara was, as Hattie had predicted, a child who knew things. She watched and listened before she spoke, and when she spoke it was usually worth the wait. She was devoted to Esther with a particular intensity that Esther recognized because it was the mirror of her own devotion to her sister, the devotion between a woman and the person who understands her. Only in this case the woman was a child, and the understanding was still being established. Esther read to both children in the evenings, whatever she could get her hands on, because the territory was not abundantly supplied with books, but she was resourceful about it, ordering from Topeka and corresponding with Hattie, who had a good collection, and was generous with it. She told them stories from Ohio, the landscape of her own childhood, the wide flat farmland and the cold winters, and the way Clara had told stories, fast and funny, full of details that were probably embellished but were more interesting than the strict truth. She told them about Clara, not as a sad story, or not only as one, but as a real person who had lived and loved and wanted things and been funny and brave. She wanted her daughter to know her namesake as more than a name. She wanted James to know his aunt as a person, because people who have been loved should stay present in the lives of those who carry them. Edwin listened to these stories from whatever chair he occupied on evenings at home, sometimes reading, sometimes working on some piece of equipment or accounting, always within earshot. He added, occasionally, the details she gave him about Clara, repeating them back in ways that demonstrated he had been paying attention, building a picture of a person he had never met from the materials she provided. "She sounds like she would have been good at this," he said once, gesturing at the window and the land beyond it, the wide Kansas sky in the evening. "She would have been extraordinary at this," Esther agreed. Hattie sold the boarding house in 1885. She was getting older, and the work was increasingly more than she wanted to carry, and she had received an offer from a hotel buyer from Kansas City who was expanding his interests and who paid her a fair price. She moved into a smaller house on the west side of Caldwell, closer to the church, and the boarding house became the Caldwell Hotel, which was a larger and noisier operation that retained none of the character of what it had been. Hattie spent more time at the Walden Ranch after that, by mutual arrangement and genuine desire. She was the closest thing to a grandmother that James and Clara had, and she performed the function with characteristic directness and without any sentiment about it, which the children responded to with the instinct children had for authenticity. James called her Miss Hattie. Clara, with the efficiency of the small, called her Hat. Della had married in 1884, a man named Peter Reeves who ran the lumber yard, and who was the right match for her in the sense that he was solid and steady and entirely unintimidated by her opinions, which was the exact combination required. They lived in Caldwell, and Della continued her work at the paper, which by 1885 was no longer unusual enough to generate commentary, because Caldwell had gotten used to her in the way towns got used to people who stayed. Esther and Della rode together to town on Tuesdays, which had become a standing arrangement, the two of them on the road with Caldwell ahead, and the prairie around them, and conversation that ranged over whatever either of them had been thinking about since the previous Tuesday. It was one of the reliable pleasures of Esther's week, those 6 miles each way, the talk and the silence both comfortable. In 1886, Edwin received a letter from his brother in Missouri. The brother Henry had been struggling with the family farm for years, and the letter was asking for help, not financial help but practical help, advice, and possibly a visit. Edwin read the letter at the dinner table and then put it down and looked at it for a while with the expression that meant he was weighing something. "Do you want to go?" Esther asked. "I should go," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "I want to go if you come with me." She had not been back to the East in 8 years. Ohio was further than Missouri, but Missouri was still East, was still the country she had left, and she thought about it seriously for the better part of a week before deciding, with the clarity that serious consideration produced, that she was not afraid of it. She was not the person who had arrived in Caldwell in 1878 with a borrowed name and afraid of grief. She was Esther Redmond Walden, a woman with a land deed and 2 children and an 8-year marriage to a man she loved honestly, and she could go east without losing herself in it. They went in the summer of 1886, the 4 of them by train from Caldwell to Topeka, and then east to Missouri, a journey that was both faster and more comfortable than the stagecoach journey that had brought Esther west 8 years before. James, who was 5, was enthralled by the train in the way that 5-year-old boys were enthralled by everything mechanical. Clara, almost 3, sat in Esther's lap and watched the country moving past the window with the same dark, serious eyes she brought to everything. Henry Walden was a lean, weathered man with his brother's coloring and a quieter quality, the weight of someone who had stayed when Edwin had gone and had carried the staying in his body ever since. His wife, Margaret, was warm and practical, and received them all with a generosity that made Esther immediately comfortable. Their children were older, 8 and 10, and took the Walden children under their collective wing with the competence of children who are accustomed to responsibility. Edwin walked the farm with his brother for most of the first day, and Esther watched them from the porch, the 2 brothers in the Missouri summer, and saw in their postures the conversation of men who had been apart for years and are finding their way back to the shared language of being family. She found herself thinking of Clara, not with the old weight of grief, which had settled long ago into something that was part of her rather than a burden on her, but with a pure and specific wishing. She wished Clara could have known this, the children and the man and the Kansas land and the feeling of having arrived, truly arrived, in a life that was fully her own. She wished Clara could have come west after all, in her own time and under her own name. She thought of the letters, the 3 months of letters she had sent under Clara's name, the deception that had been her entrance to this life. She had made her peace with it long ago, had understood it for what it was, a desperate choice by a frightened young woman who had found a way to survive. But she kept a particular reverence for it too, because it was the beginning of something real even if the beginning itself had not been. Clara's name had opened the door that Esther's own life had walked through, and that deserved acknowledgement. On the second evening in Missouri, after the children were asleep and Henry and Margaret had retired, Edwin and Esther sat on the porch of the Missouri farmhouse in the summer dark, and she told him she had been thinking about Clara. "I know," he said. "You get a particular look." "What kind of look?" "Like you're having a conversation," he said. "With someone who isn't present." She thought about that. "Yes," she said. "That's right. I think I'll always be having that conversation." "Good," he said, and meant it. "Good. She's part of how you got to me," he said. "I'm glad she's still present." She leaned against his shoulder in the Missouri dark, and he put his arm around her. And they listened to the insects in the summer night and the creek that ran somewhere behind the house. A different creek than the one on the Kansas ranch, but the same fundamental thing. Water moving through the land. Constant and indifferent and entirely beautiful. They returned to Kansas after 10 days, and Edwin spent the following months arranging a modest financial assistance for Henry that was structured as a loan, but would not, either of them knew, be called in. The family farm stabilized over the following year, and the letters between the brothers became more regular and more easy, the correspondence of men who have stopped being strangers to each other. The late 1880s brought more change to Caldwell and to the territory. The cattle trail era was genuinely ending now, the last great drives coming through in diminishing numbers as the railroad network made the long overland routes obsolete. The town was reinventing itself, more farming, more permanence, more families putting down roots in the way that the cattle trade had never quite encouraged. Schools were more established. The church had expanded. The newspaper that Della worked for was covering more local civic life and less cattle business. Esther's sewing work evolved with the times. The alterations and basic dress work were always there, but she had developed a reputation over the years for more skilled work. The intricate stuff that not everyone could do, wedding dresses and special occasion garments, and the kind of embroidery that was genuinely artistic. She had a workroom now, a proper one, in the converted back bedroom of the ranch house, with 2 windows and a long table and the best lamp oil that could be obtained, because she worked in the evenings after the children slept and the light needed to be good. James at 7 was growing into his father's seriousness, with the added quality of a child who had grown up with stories and was becoming a reader, which delighted Esther without entirely surprising her. He was the child who, when given a choice between going out to see something and having something explained to him thoroughly, would take the explanation and then go see the thing, because he wanted both. He helped Edwin in the way that was becoming genuine help rather than imitation, with the livestock and the fence maintenance, and the morning routines that kept a farm running. Clara at 4 was already an exact small person, already recognizably herself in the way that some children were very early. She was patient and observant, and had a habit of asking questions that were several steps beyond where you expected her to be, which was occasionally startling and always engaging. She had also, and this had been noted by Hattie with considerable satisfaction, an aptitude for sewing. She sat beside Esther in the workroom sometimes on quiet afternoons, and watched with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely learning, and she had graduated from watching to attempting with a stitch ripper at age 4, which meant her actual work was preliminary, but her intention was serious. "She'll surpass you," Hattie said once, watching Clara thread a needle with a concentration that adults rarely brought to the task. "Good," Esther said. The winter of 1888 was a hard one, which the territory was accustomed to, but it had a particular quality that tested everyone. The cold came in December and stayed with the intractability of something that had decided to make a point. Cattle losses were higher than usual across the county, and the spring of 1889 was preceded by a period of anxious calculation on every farm and ranch in the area as the actual numbers of the winter's toll became clear. The Walden property came through better than many, because Edwin had prepared carefully in the autumn, had brought the cattle to the most sheltered pastures earlier than usual, had stored more hay than the previous year's estimate suggested was necessary. The careful preparation was the result of the same patient attention he applied to everything, the observation of patterns, the willingness to prepare for the possibility you hoped would not occur. They did not come through unscathed. They lost 11 cattle to the winter, which was real and felt in the spring accounting, and there was a period of sober calculation about the year ahead. But they had the reserves and the land and the work, and by summer the herds had begun to rebuild and the accounts had stabilized and the crisis, which had been real, had passed without becoming catastrophic. The spring of 1889 brought something else, something the whole territory had been anticipating with varying degrees of excitement and apprehension. The unassigned lands to the south, the territory that would become Oklahoma, were opened to settlement in April in what became known as the Land Run, the extraordinary moment when thousands of settlers poured into former Indian territory to claim homesteads. Caldwell was one of the staging towns, and the weeks before the run were chaotic with arrivals, the main street crowded with wagons and horses and people from every direction, all of them carrying the particular quality of people who believe they are about to get something for nothing, though the truth was, as it always was, more complicated than that. Esther watched the preparations from the shop window and felt the familiar ambivalence, the excitement of new possibility and the knowledge of what was being taken away to create it, the land that had been designated for the Cherokee and other nations, which was being reduced further in service of the settler appetite that never seemed to be satisfied. She said this to Edwin in the evening, and he agreed, because he was a man who could see clearly when he chose to, and he said that the excitement of a land run had a way of making people not look at what they were running over to get there. They did not participate in the land run. They had their land, their own place, the 200 acres they had purchased fairly from a man who had used it well. They did not need to add to it at the cost of what was being taken. The 1890s arrived with the quality of a new era asserting itself, the territory shifting, the economy diversifying, the character of the region becoming more complex as the simplicity of the cattle drive era was replaced by the layered reality of established settlement. Caldwell was a different town than it had been in 1878 when Esther had stepped off the stagecoach in the summer heat, and she was a different person, and the relationship between these two facts, the changed town and the changed person, was a relationship she found genuinely interesting. She was 37 years old in 1890. Edwin was 40. These were ages that the territory had a way of making seem both young and seasoned simultaneously, because the West aged people in some ways and seemed to leave them in others, the particular effect of living close to something real. James was 9, tall for his age and serious in the particular way of children who have grown up between books and outdoor work, with the vocabulary of both. He had decided, with the definitiveness of a child who does not change his mind often but means it when he does, that he was going to be a rancher. Not just any rancher, their rancher, the one who would know this specific land the way his father knew it. Edwin received this information with the same careful attention he gave everything, did not encourage it beyond its merit or discourage it beyond what was honest, but engaged with it as the real thing the boy intended it to be. Clara was 6, in the first year of the school that had been established in a proper building in the area, and was making a reputation there for the same quality she displayed at home, the ability to sit very still and absorb everything, and then produce an answer or a piece of work that demonstrated she had been somewhere entirely else in her mind while apparently attending to the obvious. Her teacher, a young woman from Illinois named Miss Bradshaw, sent home a note in Clara's second month of school that said simply, "Your daughter is remarkable. I mean this as information, not as flattery." Esther put the note in the leather journal where she wrote to Clara her sister and added, "She is. She is remarkable and her dark eyes are very much like yours and she is going to do things we cannot imagine. This is what you wanted, I think. A life wider than the circumstances allowed. Here it is. In 1891, Esther discovered she was expecting again. She was 38, which was not young for a pregnancy in the standards of the time, and she told Edwin with the mixed feelings of a woman who understood the risks and was glad anyway. He received it in the way he received important things, with stillness and then with the full weight of his attention. Doctor Weiss, who was still practicing in Caldwell and had been their doctor through both previous births and through the various ailments and injuries of ranch and farm life, was careful and attentive throughout, and more candid with Esther than he might have been with a patient he assessed as less capable of honesty, which was the right call. He told her what to watch for, what was normal variation and what was not, and she appreciated the information and used it. The pregnancy was different from the others. Slower, more tiring, with an ache in the lower back that was not alarming but was persistent. She reduced her workload, which she did reluctantly, and Edwin managed with the tact of a man who knows that pointing out the obvious is less useful than making it easy. Hattie came more regularly and took on a quiet role in the household management that was presented as socializing and was in fact assistance, offered with enough dignity that it could be received without cost to Esther's sense of herself. The baby, a boy, arrived in the spring of 1892 with considerably less drama than his presence in the world suggested warranted, coming quickly and with apparent purpose. He was smaller than James had been, but vigorous in the way that some smaller babies were, with strong lungs and a clear intention to make his position known. They named him Robert Henry Walden, Robert for no particular person, simply because it was the name they both liked and felt suited to the child when they saw him. Henry for Edwin's brother, who received the news by letter and wrote back with a warmth that confirmed the repair of that relationship was complete. 3, Edwin said, looking at his youngest son in the spring evening. 3, Esther agreed. James, 10 years old and accustomed to being the settled authority on his younger sister, had approximately 2 weeks of adjustment before he settled into the role of older brother to Robert with the same seriousness he brought to everything, which was both touching and slightly formal and entirely James. Clara, at 8, simply absorbed the new person into her understanding of the world with the tranquil efficiency she brought to new information, and immediately began researching the care of infants with a thoroughness that briefly alarmed Esther until she understood it was not anxiety but genuine curiosity. The years folded into each other with the texture of lives that are being well used. Robert grew past the infant stage into a cheerful and mobile small person who had his father's stillness in reversed polarity, an absolute commitment to being in motion that made the years of his toddlerhood a study in rapid response and strategic containment. He was nothing like James and nothing like Clara and entirely himself, which was exactly right. Hattie's health began to decline in 1894. Not suddenly, but in the gradual way that age worked, removing things in small increments rather than in dramatic gestures. She was 66, and the years of the boarding house and the shop and the hard Kansas winters had accumulated in the way they did. She remained entirely herself in terms of directness and observation, but she moved more slowly and tired more easily, and her world, which had always been a specific and well-known one, became more specific and more local. Esther rode to town to see her every Tuesday without fail, regardless of what the week contained. This was not an obligation, though she would have honored it as one. It was something she wanted, the two of them in Hattie's smaller house with the tea things between them, the conversation of women who had known each other for 16 years through the accumulation of ordinary days and significant moments. "You know," Hattie said one Tuesday afternoon with the tone of someone returning to a thought they had been considering for some time, "when you came off that stagecoach you looked like someone who had decided to be fine and was not entirely sure the decision had taken." "That's accurate," Esther said. "You're fine now," Hattie said. "Genuinely fine, there's a difference." "I know," Esther said. "You're part of why." Hattie waved this away with the gesture she reserved for compliments she agreed with but did not want to dwell on. "Edwin is most of why," she said, "but you did the actual work yourself. He made it easier." "No," Hattie shook her head. "He made it worth it. You still did the work." The distinction mattered to Esther, and she held it because it was true. Edwin had been the reason to put down the borrowed name and the practiced grief and the careful management of hoping. But she had been the one who had done it, who had walked into his directness with her own and let herself be known. That was hers. Hattie died in December of 1895, in her small house on the west side of Caldwell, in her own bed, with Esther beside her, and the black-eyed Susans that Esther had brought from the ranch in a glass of water on the windowsill. She died in the way of people who have arranged their lives well, with nothing important unsaid and everything that mattered in its proper place. Esther stayed with her through the last hours and held her hand and said the things that needed saying. And when it was over, she sat for a while in the quiet room and thought about the word home, about all the ways a place and a person could mean that word at once. She drove back to the ranch in the December evening with the stars coming out over the prairie, and Edwin met her at the door, and she went into his arms and stood there in the cold doorway for a long time, and he held her with the full weight of his steady, certain presence, and she let herself be held because she had long since learned that allowing it was not weakness but wisdom. James, 15, came quietly to the kitchen and made tea without being asked. Clara, 12, sat with Esther afterward and asked her to tell stories about Hattie, and Esther told them, the good ones, the funny ones, the ones that captured the exact quality of that particular woman, and Clara listened the way she listened to everything, with her whole attention. Robert, 3 years old and not yet understanding the full weight of death but understanding something, climbed into Esther's lap during the stories and stayed there, which was its own kind of comfort. The following years were ones that had the character of fulfillment rather than anticipation. Not that nothing happened, plenty happened. The territory changed, and the children grew, and the ranch required its constant attention, and the world outside Kansas was making the noises it always made. But the fundamental quality of the life was one of having arrived and being present in the arrival. Edwin was a good rancher and a better father than he gave himself credit for, which Esther told him regularly enough that he had, over the years, begun to believe it. He and James had a working relationship that was one of the genuinely moving things she observed in her daily life, father and son in the pasture or the barn, or riding the fence line, the older man teaching and the younger one learning, and the land between them the common language. Clara at 15 was everything her early years had promised. She was reading everything she could obtain, which was more than Caldwell could supply locally, and so involved correspondence with a lending library in Topeka and regular raids on Della's book collection, and the emerging collection at the new public reading room that had been established in 1896. She sewed with a skill that had surpassed Esther's basic work and was moving toward the artistic, the kind of sewing that was closer to drawing than to craft. She was also, with a directness that reminded Esther of Hattie, developing opinions about the world that she expressed without apology. "She's going to want more than this territory can offer her," Edwin said one evening, watching Clara bent over a book at the kitchen table. "Yes," Esther agreed. "Are you all right with that?" "I want everything for her," Esther said. "Every bit of sky she can take." She paused. "Clara, my sister, wanted everything too. She just didn't get to have it." She looked at her daughter. "This one is going to get it." Edwin put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they watched their daughter read in the lamplight, and the kitchen was warm and the night outside was large, and the life they had built together was as real and durable as anything Esther had ever known. Robert at 5 was coming into his own as a specific person, revealing the particular combination of his parents' qualities that made him distinctly himself. He had Edwin's patience with animals and a surprising gift for mechanical understanding, spending long attentive periods watching the workings of anything that moved, the pump mechanism, the windmill that had been installed near the well, the gearing of a wagon. He was the person who, if something broke, wanted to know not just that it was broken but exactly how and why, which was going to be either very useful or occasionally frustrating, depending on the urgency of the repair. In the spring of 1898, James turned 17 and had a conversation with his father that Edwin relayed to Esther that evening with the expression of a man who is proud and also slightly winded. James wanted to buy the adjacent property, the 50 acres that had become available when old Mercer on the north side had died without heirs. He wanted to expand the ranch, not immediately, not without proper planning, but as a declared intention, a direction. He priced it out, Edwin said. James did. He had the figures. What we have in reserve, what a loan would cost, what the additional pasture could support in terms of herd size, what the return on that would be over 10 years. He paused. He's 17, Esther smiled. He's been watching you do exactly that kind of calculation his whole life. I know, Edwin said. It's something to see it come back like that. What did you tell him? I told him we would look at it together. They looked at it together, the three of them, Edwin and Esther and James, at the kitchen table with the figures and the land office description and the practical assessment of what was possible. It was a real conversation, all three of them contributing, James's youth and ambition balanced by Edwin's experience, and Esther's particular gift for seeing what a plan actually required rather than what it hoped to cost. They bought the 50 acres in September, James's first investment in the land he intended to know. The turn of the century came on a January night that was cold and clear and full of stars, with the kind of clarity that the Kansas winter produced when it was not punishing but simply honest. Esther stood on the east porch with Edwin's arm around her shoulders and looked at the stars and thought about the woman she had been in 1878, 25 years old, stepping off a stagecoach in a borrowed name, and the woman she was in 1900, 47 years old, standing on her own land with her own name in every register that mattered. James was 18 and beginning his full working partnership with Edwin, tall and dark and serious, the east pasture already partly his domain in terms of daily management. Clara was 16 and formidable, and in correspondence with a women's college in Ohio that was accepting applications, which Esther was watching with a feeling that was complicated and simple in equal measure. Complicated because it meant Clara leaving, simple because she had promised Clara the sky, and this was some of it. Robert was 7 and had taken apart and successfully reassembled the kitchen clock, which was the kind of thing you could be both exasperated and impressed by, and which Edwin had resolved by getting him a broken clock of his own to work on. 22 years, Edwin said, looking at the stars. Since I arrived, she said. Since you arrived. She looked at the familiar profile of his face against the star-bright sky. The weathering of 2 decades more, the silver coming into the dark hair, the lines that were the accumulated record of attention and care and outdoor years. She loved his face with the depth of long knowing, with the particular love that is not the breathless first discovery but is the arrival at something essential, the love that says, "This is the person, this has always been the person, this will always be the person." I was wearing so many things when I came, she said. The name and the grief and the, I know, he said, and you asked which one was heavier. I wanted to understand what you were carrying, he said. You've been carrying some of it with me since, she said. That's what it's for, he said. 2 people carrying things together, the things get lighter. She took his hand in both of hers and held it, and they stood in the first night of the new century on the porch of their home with the Kansas stars above them and the prairie around them and the sleeping sound of their children in the house behind. And the grief she still carried was there, as it would always be, but it was not heavy, or not only heavy, it was also warm, because grief was the shadow of love and she had loved greatly. Clara would have been 45 next month, she said. Tell me something about her, Edwin said. She had told him 1,000 things about Clara over 22 years. He asked this question regularly, not from obligation but from genuine desire to know, because Clara was part of the foundation and he honored the foundation. She used to sing when she thought nobody was listening, Esther said. Not well, she was not a good singer, but she sang with complete commitment, like the quality didn't matter and the act was everything. She paused. I think that's how she approached most things. Like coming west, Edwin said. Like coming west, Esther agreed. She had decided she was going to do it and she committed completely, and the quality of the preparation was secondary to the intention. And then you brought the intention here, he said. And did a better job of the preparation, she said. He laughed, and she heard in his laugh the accumulation of 22 years of the particular timbre of his voice, the low warmth of it, and she pressed his hand and looked at the stars. Clara, the daughter, left for Ohio in September of 1901 to begin her studies, and the day she boarded the train in Caldwell was one of the most layered days of Esther's experience, layered with pride and grief, and the extraordinary doubling of sending a child named Clara east to Ohio on a train, going in the opposite direction from the one Esther had traveled 23 years before. She hugged her daughter on the platform and felt the slim, certain strength of her, the dark, serious eyes that had always known things, and she said, "Write every week. Tell me everything." Clara did write every week. Her letters were detailed and exact and full of the particular quality of a mind encountering new territory with the full force of its attention, and Esther read them aloud sometimes at the dinner table, sharing her daughter's progress with Edwin and James and Robert. And the letters were like dispatches from the wide sky that had always been Clara's inheritance. The ranch was fully James's co-domain by 1902, Edwin shifting into the senior advisory role with the ease of a man who had always valued competence over authority. James managed the daily operations with his father's methodical intelligence, and something of his own added, a quicker willingness to try new approaches that the changing agricultural landscape required. The relationship between father and son was one of mutual respect that had the warmth of genuine love beneath it, the love that had grown from 20 years of shared work and shared mornings, and the accumulated language of two people who have built things together. Robert at 9 had found his thing, the machinery. Everything mechanical. He had moved from the kitchen clock to the pump mechanism to the windmill, and, with the arrival of more agricultural machinery in the region, had developed a reputation as the person who could fix things. At 9, this was still a hobby supervised by amused adults, but the direction of it was clear enough that Edwin, with the patience of a man who planned for what was likely, had already been thinking about where a mechanical education could be obtained when the time came. In 1904, Clara came home from Ohio for the summer, and she was recognizably herself but more, the same serious dark eyes and the methodical intelligence, but filled out, confident in the particular way of someone who has discovered that their mind is a valuable thing and has stopped apologizing for it. She brought books and conversation, and a quality of energy that made the house feel different, fuller, and Esther watched her daughter move through the rooms of the house and felt a love so specific it was almost a language. Clara had, in her second year of study, found an interest in education, in the teaching of children, in the methods and the philosophy of it, and she spoke about it with the same commitment that Hattie had described as Clara's inheritance from her namesake, the decision made and the intention total. "You'll teach," Esther said, over a dinner in July. "I will," Clara said. "I want to come back here. There are children in this territory who deserve better than they get from the current school arrangements." Edwin looked at his daughter, and the look was the one Esther had first seen on his face 26 years ago beside the creek, the look of someone who is seeing the actual thing. "Your grandmother Hattie would have liked that very much," he said. Clara, who had grown up on stories of Hattie, smiled with the full force of her serious face. "I know," she said. James, 23, had taken a particular interest in a young woman from a neighboring farm, Helen Bauer, whose family had homesteaded on the north side of Caldwell 5 years before. Helen was a capable, steady young woman with practical skills and a quiet humor that surfaced unexpectedly. And Esther, watching her son with her, recognized the particular quality of a man in the early stages of learning someone by heart. She said nothing, because she had been given space at the beginning and understood its value. But she made Helen welcome at the table and watched with deep satisfaction as the acquaintance progressed through the seasons from polite to comfortable to the kind of easy familiarity that preceded declarations. James spoke to Edwin about Helen in October of 1904 and to Esther the following morning, and the conversation was the one that these conversations always were at their best. A son telling his parents about the person who had become essential to him, and the parents receiving this with the full warmth of people who understand exactly what he is telling them. He proposed to Helen in November. She accepted with the directness of a woman who had made up her mind some months before and was glad the question had finally arrived. They were married in the spring of 1905, a May wedding at the same church where Edwin and Esther had been married 27 years before, and the occasion had that particular resonance, the sense of something continuing and repeating in its best form. Esther stood in the church and watched her son be married and thought of her own June wedding in 1879, the cream dress she had made herself, the minister's voice, the way Edwin's face had looked. She reached over and took Edwin's hand, and he curled his fingers around hers without looking, because after 26 years they did not need to look to find each other. Robert, 13, served as a witness with the slightly formal bearing of a young person who is taking a serious responsibility seriously, and his expression was the one he brought to anything mechanical, focused, and respectful of the craft, which was perhaps the highest compliment he knew how to pay. Clara, 22 and in her final year of study, had come home for the wedding and brought a quality of complete gladness about her brother and his new wife that was entirely characteristic, the full commitment. Helen came to live on the ranch, and the household expanded and adjusted with the organic ease of people who were fundamentally compatible. Helen had her own skills and her own ways of doing things, and Esther made room for these with the genuine intention of a woman who understood that there was more than one right way to run a kitchen and manage a household, and that the important thing was not her own methods, but the continuation of a good life. By 1906, Robert was 14 and had fixed a number of items on neighboring properties that grown men had given up on, and Edwin had arranged for him to spend time in the summer with a machinist in Wichita who could teach him the formal principles behind what he was doing by instinct. Robert went to Wichita with the look of someone going where they were always going to go, and came back at the end of the summer larger in some way, expanded by the discovery that what he did intuitively had names and structures and history. Clara completed her studies and returned to Kansas in the autumn of 1906, as she had said she would. She took a teaching position at the consolidated school that served the area outside Caldwell, and she arrived at the school on the first morning with a lesson plan and the same dark, serious eyes and the full weight of her intention. And within a term she had become exactly what she had promised herself she would become, someone the children knew as the teacher who expected them to surprise her and was reliably surprised. She was 23 and living at the ranch, and the house that had sometimes felt large since James had established himself in the foreman's cottage had a full quality again, all four of them at table most evenings, Edwin and Esther and Clara and Robert, the conversations ranging over whatever the day had contained. The year 1907 brought Oklahoma's statehood, the territory to the south officially becoming a state, and Esther sat on the east porch in the November morning and thought about what that meant, the particular weight of the history that had preceded it, the decades of displacement and loss that had been the price of this political event. She was 54 years old and had watched the territory change for 29 years, had watched what was taken and what was given and who paid the cost, and the statehood was not a simple thing. She talked about this with Edwin, as she talked about everything with Edwin, and he listened and added what he had observed, and they sat together with the complicated truth of the place they lived, the beauty and the injustice and the fact of their own belonging in it, and what that belonging had cost. In 1908, James and Helen had their first child, a boy they named Edwin Thomas Walden, and the arrival of a grandchild was a category of experience that Esther had not precisely anticipated in its full quality. She held the boy, who was small and determined-looking in the way of all newborns, and felt the particular love that was larger than the specific person, the love that was also for James and for Edwin, and for the whole accumulated fact of this family. Edwin held his grandson with the hands that had held James 27 years before, and his face was doing the same thing it had done then, the wonder that has no prior experience to reference. "Edwin Thomas," Esther said beside him. "Thomas for Helen's father," Edwin said. "I know. But Edwin first," she said. He looked at her. There were lines in his face now that she knew as well as her own, the years of sun and attention and weather and care. He was 58 years old, and he was, she thought, exactly who he had always been, only more completely, more fully settled into himself. "Edwin first," he agreed, and the smile was the one she had been cataloging for 30 years, the one that transformed his face. Robert, 16, looked at his nephew with the scientific interest he brought to all new things, and declared him well designed. James, catching his sister's eye across the room, smiled with the particular smile of siblings who have shared a family their whole lives and know each other's frequencies. Clara, 25, held the baby with the competence of someone who had researched the topic thoroughly and was applying the findings, and the baby held her finger with the arbitrary certainty of newborns, and Esther watched and felt the full weight of having arrived, truly and completely, in a life that was rich beyond what the frightened young woman on the stagecoach could have imagined. She went to the east porch that evening, the November evening of her grandson's birth, and she stood with the cold air on her face and the stars beginning above the prairie and the lights of the house behind her, and she opened herself to the full inventory of what her life contained. The grief for Clara was there, as it had always been, the fundamental frequency. 29 years since April of 1878, and the loss was still true, would always be true, because Clara had been real and her absence was real. But the grief had been transformed, alchemized by time and love and use, into something that was part of the structure of Esther rather than a weight on it. Clara was in the name of her daughter and in the journal that had 30 years of entries now. Clara was in the decision that had brought Esther west. Clara was in the wide sky above the ranch and in the creek that ran along the east pasture and in the black-eyed Susans in the porch boxes every spring. Edwin came to stand beside her. He put his arm around her shoulders in exactly the way he had first done 26 years ago on this same porch on a December night, and she leaned into it in exactly the way she had learned she could. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About everything," she said. "That's a large subject." "It's a large life," she said, "larger than I knew to want." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "You know," he said, "when I picked up that trunk on the main street, I looked at you and I thought there is a person carrying more than a trunk. You could tell that from the street. I could tell that from looking at you," he said. "You had that particular quality of someone who is very carefully not putting anything down. And you asked which was heavier," she said. "Eventually," he said, "I had to wait for the right moment." She laughed, and the laugh was 30 years of him, the dry timing and the genuine precision and the warmth that had always been underneath both. "The grief was heavier," she said. "Always the grief." "But you put the name down," he said. "I put the name down," she agreed. "And then I could start to put other things down too." "And what are you carrying now?" he asked. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved, this man who had always asked her real questions. She thought about the ranch under the November stars and the children and the grandchild born today, and the sister who had died, and the name she had carried, and the life she had built, and the grief that was also love and the love that was also grief. And she thought about Hattie and Della and Caldwell and the East Porch and 30 years of Tuesday mornings. "Everything that is mine," she said. "All of it. And it is not heavy." He pressed her close and she turned into him and put her face against his neck and breathed the familiar smell of him, wool and hay and the outdoors and something that was simply him, Edwin, this specific man she had loved for 30 years across 100 varieties of ordinary day. The stars moved their slow track above the Kansas prairie. The house held its warmth. Inside, a new generation was sleeping his first sleep in the world, carrying the name of the man on the porch and the legacy of the woman in his arms. And the future was not something to fear but something to lean toward, the way the black-eyed Susans leaned toward the light, without effort, because it was simply what they were made to do. In the spring, Esther planted more flowers. James and Helen put their own flower boxes on the porch of the foreman's cottage, at Helen's insistence, with seeds that Esther had given her. Robert, home for a weekend from his apprenticeship in Wichita, observed this with approval and pronounced the structural integrity of the boxes sound, which was his way of saying he was glad to be home. Clara sat on the steps and read aloud from a book of poems that had come in the mail, because there was no reason not to have poems in the afternoon. Edwin stood in the yard and looked at his family spread across the spring morning of his 59th year, and Esther, watching him from the porch, saw his face in the April light, the face she had first seen on a dusty Caldwell street holding her trunk, the face that had asked her which was heavier, the face that had looked at her in the church, and the face that had been beside her in every subsequent morning of her life. He looked over and met her eyes and gave that small, serious smile, the one she had been cataloging since 1878. She smiled back. The prairie was wide and the sky was wider and the life they had built together was true and durable and full. And Esther Redmond Walden was home, in every meaning of the word, entirely and finally and completely home.